Hi everyone, I'm Mercedes with Rocky Nook. Thanks for joining us today for this exciting webinar with William Neill about his book Light on the Landscape. It's going to be pretty great. I just want to cover a couple things before we get started. I said, again, my name is Mercedes. I'm with Rocky Nook. We're a publisher of photography books. Some of you are probably familiar with us, some of you aren't, but you can go ahead and check out our catalog at rockynook.com. We have a lot of exciting books about photography and landscape photography that you might find interesting if photography is your hobby, your passion, your profession. So go ahead and check that out. Today we have with us William Neill. He's the author of Light on the Landscape. Just want to tell you a little bit about him and his book before he takes it over. William Neill is a landscape photographer who conveys the deep spiritual beauty he sees and feels in nature. His photography has been widely published in books, magazines, and posters. His limited edition prints have been collected and exhibited in museums and galleries nationally. Since 1997, he's been a regular columnist for Outdoor Photographer magazine. His work has been published in numerous books, including 2017's William Neill Photographer, a Retrospective, a collection of photographs taken over the past 40 years. He's been a resident of the Yosemite National Park area since 1977, and today he's going to talk with us about his new book, Light on the Landscape. I just want to tell you a little bit about Light on the Landscape, which is that we are offering two different versions of this book. One is a limited edition hardcover signed copy. You can find that information on our website, and that's also in the email you received after you registered for this webinar. And then that also has a link for the softcover version of the book as well. So your email that you received after you registered for this webinar included coupon codes for both those versions of the books. And then tomorrow you'll receive another email from us, which will include those two coupon codes again, and also a replay to this video. So if you want to go back and watch it again, or if you had a question or missed something, you'll be able to watch this video again tomorrow. So just keep an eye on your email for those deals and for the replay. And just one quick note before we get right to it is go ahead and submit any of your questions for William Neill in the chat just throughout the webinar. We'll answer questions at the end, but you could submit them at any time, and I'll keep an eye on those so we can ask Bill at the end and get those answers for you. So you're not here to see me, you are here to see William Neill, and this is going to be a very exciting webinar, so I will let him take it over from here. Hi, Bill. You with us?
Yes, I am.
Great.
I am ready to
Thank
go.
you. Great. I will let you take it over from here. I look forward to seeing your presentation.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everybody. I am talking to you from the foothills of the Sierra Nevada near Yosemite. And my presentation today is going to be based on one of the chapters in the book that talks about portfolio development. And I want to help you learn to teach, learn to edit your work, and develop thematic themes that will more powerfully communicate what you're trying to say. And I'm going to jump right into the presentation. Once again, thanks to Rocky Nook, and thanks to all of you that have showed up today. To get organized a little bit here. Thank you for waiting. There we go. All right, the title of this session is called Thinking in Themes. And I'm going to try to help you find your passion, develop depth, and learn to edit tightly. Before I get started, I'd like to give you a little background. I'd like to show this photograph of myself and Ansel Adams in about 1980. And just to back up a little bit, my education is in environmental conservation from the University of Colorado a long time ago, as you can see. I've resided in the Yosemite area for 43 years. Probably one of the biggest moments in my career was when I got a job at the Ansel Adams Gallery. My good friend, Louis Kemper, who I think might be out there, I came into the store one day to turn in some slide film, and he knew I was looking for a job and he was leaving, and he said, "Do you want my job?" And I said, "Of course I want your job." And I think I was hired that day, and worked 1980 through 1984. And all those years Ansel was alive and I got to know him, which was a big part of the start of my career. Let's see, in 1980, I was 26. One of the biggest events while I worked at the Ansel Adams Gallery was that I was able to show Ansel my work, and they were including people for representation, and I got to show my work to Ansel, and he approved my work to be shown at the gallery. I left the Ansel Adams Gallery in 1984, and I've been self-employed ever since. That sounds pretty exciting. I haven't had a boss in all those years, but I also have barely had a day off. So there's a give and take to that. I wouldn't do it any other way. But now after all these years, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Anyway, I'm the photographic author of 9 major books, and I'll just show you the title here. My photograph was taken in the early 80s with a view camera, which I used for about 20 years. This is Lighting Meadow in Yosemite. And you'll see the list of books. Light on the Landscape is the one we're talking about today. About 3 years ago, I did this retrospective book. And then back in the 90s, I did a series of books with the Nature Company and the Exploratorium, as well as a book on Yosemite called Yosemite, The Promise of Wildness. What I'm going to do at the beginning of this program is just go through, in a fairly simple way, some of the key elements, how somebody would get started thinking in themes, developing a portfolio. And I strongly believe you can become a better photographer when you learn how to edit. Learning how to focus your images into a thematic portfolio that reflects your passion and your vision. By showing your very best work, and only your very best work, presented in a tightly focused theme, your work can communicate with your audience more powerfully. And by way of illustration, I'm going to be going through a series of images to show you the groups of portfolios that I've come up with over the years. Really, my primary portfolio and the title of one of my books is Landscapes of the Spirit. Antarctic Dreams, Meditations in Monochrome, was fairly obviously black and white work. By Nature's Design, that's the title of a book I did with the Exploratorium, and continues to be a major part of my photography and a major theme that I continue to develop. My Yosemite portfolio I call Sanctuary in Stone. Yosemite has been my major teacher in all these 43 years, living in or near the park. And then a series that I started about 10 years ago called Impressions of Light. Okay, back to the key points of how to find your focus. Like I said before, many photographers would benefit from being more focused. Most of us have busy lives and we go off in different directions, and we're traveling with family or other kinds of distractions. And so I taught photography in the field quite a bit for years, and I had people returning for more workshops, and then I would see their work each time they would come, and I was concerned I wasn't seeing the progress I thought was possible. So I developed a course that I taught online called Portfolio Development, and this is the foundation of that course. One of the key things in developing a thematic portfolio is really figuring out what truly inspires you. Photographers tend to be generalists, where they're interested in photographing their family and photographing architecture while they're traveling, or lots of different subjects. And we often don't spend the time, what I've observed in student work, to really find a specific focus. It might be a place. It might be a subject matter. You said the subjects can be broad or narrow in a theme, such as forest, or just focusing on aspen trees or maple trees. Your portfolio could be on Death Valley in general, or just the dunes of Death Valley. But the important thing is to find that focus. And then with that theme in mind, you can start to create new work. When you look at a body of work, if you organize it well, you can see that, maybe a certain place, you don't have enough of one season, or you have all scenics and no intimate landscapes. So you can develop a portfolio by seeing where you are and then seeing what images could be added to strengthen that portfolio. One of the key things I see when people organize their work is that the standard of quality often is fairly uneven. And that's okay, but you really need to be a tough editor. It's important to establish that standard of quality, and defining your goals will help with this process. And just sort of as an aside, what is the standard of quality? Whose standard is it? Well, it's your standard. It's a subjective thing. It's hard to teach, it's hard to describe in words, but if you are a tough editor and you take out the photographs that have a distracting background or a little out of focus, you start elevating the general level of your work. If you show me 20 images and 15 of them are fantastic and 5 are pretty average, those 5 will dilute the 20. So it's better to show somebody a highly refined, tightly edited series like, say, that 15. If you know where you are, that is, you go through your body of work and you assess your body of work, see what you have in certain themes, then it's much easier to visualize where you're going. And it's important to see progress in your work. We all get frustrated sometimes, like, God, I'm not getting any better. What's going wrong? And if you focus and work hard to improve your work hard to improve your craft, your theme will grow in quality and depth, and your lesser images will fall by the wayside, and that level will continue to elevate. So look for consistency. However you show your work, whether it's a book or online or in a gallery, presenting consistent and high quality work will help your images become more memorable to the viewer. And when you don't edit tightly, the perception of your abilities goes down. So one thing to remember as you're going through your editing, just because you got the best composition or the most fantastic light doesn't necessarily mean it belongs in the portfolio. Good composition, exposure, choice of lens, depth of focus, etc., are only tools in the creative image making process. This will be pretty basic for some of you, if not most of you, but I'm going to go through it. It's surprising when you teach how people let lesser quality images sneak in. Well, that's a beautiful image, but it's out of focus. That shouldn't be shown. As far as exposure, it seems obvious you have to have good exposure, but it doesn't always happen if you're not editing tightly. The quality of exposure is subjective. A dark and moody photograph can be effective for one mood. As I say here, bright areas that are overexposed, you obviously don't want that. And then a lot of times I see areas in shadows, underexposed areas that have lost life and have gone kind of a dead black. So that could be fixed in processing, but you have to judge the exposure, to put it simply. Obviously check sharpness. But if you don't zoom in at 100%, you're not going to really know. And you have to look all through the photograph. And sometimes we get captivated by the subject and then kind of forget that the light might not be that exciting. Lots and lots of my photographs were taken after another visit to a place. So I notice a great composition and the light's not so good, and then I have to come back. But often when you're traveling, you're just going to take a picture anyway. So when you're back editing, you're going to say, well, you know, that was a great composition, but the light isn't working for me. It could have been better. If it's someplace you can go back to, you can try for better conditions. Pet peeve for me in critiquing work is composition. I'm pretty adamant about making clean, kind of decisive compositions, decisive cropping. Is the intended subject clearly defined? Are there distracting elements in front, behind, or on the edges? That is something you can get distracted by the subject. You're trying to get the focus and other things, and then you miss that leaf that's bright on the edge and out of focus and can take away or ruin the photograph. And the bottom line really is what you communicate. So checking for content, what are you saying? Does this photograph mean anything or say anything? Does it say anything about you? Does something about, you know, your likes come through? What is the subject coming through in the way that translates for you? Is it unique and creative? And in teaching photography and learning photography over the years myself, I've come to call the learning process the feedback loop. Once you establish a benchmark for quality and you set some goals, there is a feedback loop that gives you a way to monitor your progress. You establish a benchmark for a portfolio that we're talking about in this case. Maybe you find some holes in it, you want a different season or a different flower or a different tree, and you go out and create new work. And then you're back in the computer and you assess that work. And then you go to your portfolio, use collections in Lightroom, and see if those photographs add to the theme in general and to the quality of it. And then the hardest part is rejecting lesser images. But it's so important to, obviously you've heard this before, learn from your mistakes. But a lot of us don't really want to focus on that too much, so it's just a reminder to take advantage of those mistakes and try not to make them again. I make as many mistakes as anyone out there. So obviously learning from successes and failures. There's a great line that John Sexton used to say, the only thing different between me and my students is that I've made more mistakes. I love that quote. And you have to be forgiving of yourself. You know, we all want to see progress, but creativity doesn't come in a linear fashion. There's an ebb and flow to the process, and building a portfolio takes time, and there'll be times when you're not sure where to go with it. Maybe you put it aside and you start a different portfolio. Next phase of this session, I'm going to go through images. And what I'm going to be showing you is the portfolios I mentioned earlier, starting with Landscapes of the Spirit. And hopefully you will get some ideas for your photographs, maybe a little inspiration, and just see how a group of photographs works as a set. So I'm starting out with my favorite theme, landscapes of the spirit. This is from the book, The Beauty of Nature Motivates and Inspires My Photography. It nourishes my artistic sensibility and restores my spiritual balance. In landscapes of silent rock, reflecting water, and parting cloud, I feel most connected to myself and to life itself. In the clarity of wilderness light, my mind and my heart are soothed and uplifted by the serenity of creation. These are landscapes of and for my spirit. Now, as I go through these photographs, I'm going to talk about them in a general sense, just some technical things or stories about them, but also you'll see, hopefully, that photographs have a unity as I go through them in each portfolio. One of my favorite, and I'm not going to talk about every photograph, by the way. So, if you have a question about a particular one, you can put that in the questions and we'll try to address them later. One of my favorite techniques in landscape photography with trees is what I call a tapestry effect, where I'm zooming in, eliminating a lot of distractions, creating an even pattern across the frame. Here you have, some chaos, but you also have some unity of the pattern goes from edge to edge. The colors kind of flow across the page. Again, I have a pattern of trunks across the frame and wonderful backlight. I often have said, and you'll see it a lot in my book, that I like to photograph in quiet light, but you'll also see that I'm not afraid of taking on dramatic light, and if it inspires me, I'm going to photograph it, whether it's a subtle, quiet scene or a dramatic scene like this wave crashing through this arch in Big Sur. One of the techniques I use a lot in more detailed photographs is trying to find a simplified background. In this case, I was in the Smokies and used the moving water behind to create a simple, smooth background that allows the branches, the leaves, and the flowers to jump out, to stand out, and have greater impact. If I'd used a fast shutter speed and the water was kind of jumbled and frozen, it would be a very confusing background. And sometimes you go out and you get something unexpected. I went to photograph this fall near where I live. And I went out very early in the morning to get flat light, even light, before the sun came up. And before it got hot, it was in August. And I had no idea that it's a little later in the morning, as the sun came up, it would give me this sunbeam across the waterfall. So I'm very open to happy accidents. I don't overplan my photo sessions. I go out and explore and let things happen, and sometimes magic does happen. Photography is more about the experience to me than the images. So just wandering around in this forest and walking around the backside of this rock, I found this amazing root, a tree going on top of the rock. And it's wonderful to get a great photograph. I love this photograph, but the experience of that discovery is even more important to me. Here's a photograph of aspen trees, a high-key translation of a backlit scene. Could have been very dark, with the leaves brightly lit and the trunks much darker. But this was a processing approach that I've done a fair amount since, but starting with this photograph, where I wanted to take a photograph that had a softer look, not overly dramatic. It's a portfolio I'm just beginning to develop called Whispers of Light. I spend a lot of time in designing a photograph, and the way this photograph works, the spacing is not random. It took me quite a bit of shuffling left to right, and planting the camera where I could create these spaces between the trees, and it gives a sense of a rhythm across the frame. And, you know, if the trees were merging in awkward, and you wouldn't see as many lines. Here's another example of designing a photograph that is a pattern, essentially, where I'm spacing out the tree trunks using the amazing fog as a design to this image. Another thing I talk about in the book, there's a chapter on sense of scale featuring this photograph. And the obvious thing when you photograph sequoias is to try to get it all in because they're so huge, and how could you possibly tell how big it is if you don't get it all in? But if you put on a wide angle lens, you'll find things shrinking, and ultimately the trees don't look quite as big. But by contrasting this massive sequoia trunk against this small fir tree, and without showing the whole scene, you imply a sense of scale. A massive tree, you only see half of the trunk here. So I'm leaving the viewer to ask a question about what is the whole thing, what is the whole scene there? And then you get that sense of scale. I just love photographing trees in the fog, as you've probably noticed by now. And again, a pattern photograph where I was in Yellowstone and worked very hard to try to get good spacing for these shadows, so you get this, the trunks, obviously, but more importantly, the shadow lines cutting through the frame. And emotion is a big part of taking a good landscape photograph, letting your emotion come through. Glacier National Park is a very important place for me. When I was in college, I spent 2 summers there. This was many years later, a couple of decades later, but I have a lot of fond memories of when I worked in Glacier, and taking this photograph just takes me back in time. I have a lot of good memories of the Tetons too. When I was a kid, we traveled to the national parks, and especially the Tetons. And this photograph, I love the photographic part of it, but the emotional part of it for me is the memories, not only of being here at this moment in time, but all the history I have with the place. So all those things can blend together to make a more powerful photograph. For this photograph, I was in New England. I had no idea where I was going to go photograph, but before I found a motel for the night, I drove by this lake, and the light wasn't anything exciting, but looked like it might have some potential. So it rained overnight, got up at dawn, and the storm was clearing, and there was the magic light. This photograph is my most important photograph, my favorite photograph, and my best-selling photograph. So it's kind of amazing that that is the case, because after I took this photograph and was traveling for a few weeks after I took this, when I got the film back several weeks later, I wasn't even sure where I'd taken the photograph. I'd gotten up in the dark to get to Lake Louise in Canada, hoping for a dramatic sunrise on the Columbia ice fields that are hidden in the clouds up at the top of the frame. And that just wasn't going to happen. So I waited and waited. And while I was waiting around, I was going to try to make the best of the situation. And I took 2 frames. I took one vertical, such as this, and then I took a horizontal that did not have the rocks in the foreground. And this was the best one. It was about a 2-minute exposure. Gives you an idea that it was pretty dark. Okay, most of the portfolios I'm showing are taken over decades, many long length of time. This next portfolio was taken in 5 days. I was an instructor on a photo tour on a on a small ship in Antarctica, and we photographed constantly for, God, it would seem about 12 hours a day, it seemed like. I took 10,000 photographs in 5 days. And it wasn't all junk. It was just that we had very trying conditions. You're in a Zodiac, 8 photographers trying to make photographs, and you just had to keep shooting. You were often moving, floating by something like this, not still, but moving, and still take what looks like a sharp, like you set up a tripod kind of a landscape. There's that same ice formation. So I was able to zoom in, but also I had 2 cameras around my neck, so I grabbed a wide angle and got this version. It's hard to describe what the situation was like, but we had 8 photographers on a Zodiac, on a raft. And if we're diagonally going past this iceberg, the front row is all kneeling down and the back row is all standing, and you have 8 photographers blazing away. And we all got along just fine. Nobody fell in or anything. So Antarctica was quite a spectacular experience, just kind of endless drama and epic scale. Just continually seeing as the cruise ship went along through some of the canals, the channels that if you felt like you went inside, you'd miss the best shot of the trip. As I often do, I find patterns in things, and Antarctica was a great place for that. The colors are surreal. This is real color. It's hard to believe, but it was the way it looked. And it was great at that. This was in February, end of January in Antarctica. So the day's sunset was like 11 o'clock or so, and lasted for, it seemed like about an hour and a half. You had great color. The next series I want to go through is black and white series. And when I worked at Ansel's gallery in Yosemite, I saw great black and white photography all the time, and I was fairly intimidated by it. I loved color landscape photography, so that's what I focused on. But when digital photography became prevalent and I was using it all the time, I started to see what could be done in the digital darkroom with black and white photography. Many of these photographs, including this one and the next one, are in Light on the Landscapes, and I write stories about the particular day or the particular technique. So hopefully when you see the book, you'll remember some of these photographs and can read up on what was happening. I really gravitate to minimalist types of photographs, and this is an ice formation on a lake in Lassen National Park. And we all have photographs that spur memories. I was on a trip with my good friend Louis Kemper, and we were photographing here, and many years later, an old friend of mine purchased this photograph for use in a Star Trek movie, Into Darkness. So this photograph actually appears in the movie. Kind of exciting. The next portfolio I'd like to go through is By Nature's Design. I just love to work with line, shape, texture, and form in all of my compositions, but it especially comes through in this series. This is an aerial photograph in Death Valley of the sand dunes at sunset. So hopefully, as I'm going through these, you can see the certain unity to each portfolio. And like I said, many of them have formed over many, many years. But I'm looking at erosion. I'm looking at patterns in plants. I'm collecting leaves off my lawn. These are leaves from my elderberry tree out in my front yard, and I collected them. And somehow these spots had formed, which is not particularly normal. And I brought them into my house and photographed them as a still life. So you can see, especially with close-up photography, I'm focusing on the shapes and forms. So one thing about a good pattern photograph is you have to have a strong design. So there's a diagonal motion across this frame, and it really, really helps that the light was spectacular. The canyon wall reflecting in the mud. Again, I especially like where I'm filling the pattern all the way out to the edge of the frame. The next series is Yosemite photographs. And what I've learned in all these years in Yosemite, that beyond its role as a nature preserve and a place of recreation, it is a sanctuary for the spirit. Yosemite has been my main teacher over these years, just learning how to see, learning weather patterns. And although I take plenty of the spectacular Yosemite scenes, I especially like these more quiet ones. Well, that's not a quiet one, but a spectacular morning in Cook's Meadow in Yosemite. This is a photograph taken after about 3 years of driving past these trees on my way home from work. So I lived in El Portel down below the valley and drove through the valley every day, 5 days a week for 5 years. And this was on the way home. I actually had tried out this composition with 35 millimeter. And then later, when I had my 4x5 camera, I made this image on the way home. Obviously, a great advantage of being near Yosemite is to catch dramatic conditions, such as this unbelievable morning in Tunnel View. This photograph was taken on the way to work. When there was probability of good snow, I would get up early enough to give myself a half an hour, 45 minutes to make some photographs before I had to get to Ansel's gallery to open up for the day. Another one of my tapestry style photographs with the snow on branches spread throughout the frame. And what I try to do in making photographs that have some magic to them is look for unusual conditions. This was a high level flood day on the Merced River and about a 2-minute exposure. So you don't really know what it's going to look like when you're photographing water for that length of time. So I just went for it and it came through for me. So right along the roadside. Many of my photographs are really not very far from the road in Yosemite. There's a lot to see if you're willing to look more closely. I was with a workshop group here, and we were photographing El Capitan, and it was spectacular. But this is my favorite photograph from that evening, when El Cap is reflected in the river, and you get that warm glow, giving that sense of time of day, and complementing the cool tones of and soft forms of the snow on the rocks. I mentioned earlier using the moving water to blur out the background. This is a great example of that. Again here, just a good way to simplify your photographs. I'm going to move a little faster here, getting closer to the end. So if you have any questions about photographs, I'm not talking about them all, but this is one thing I think you could see maybe with these series is there's a lot of variety. A close-up of a waterfall. There's, mid-range landscapes and wider landscapes. There's different seasons. And that's what I look for in a portfolio. You don't want all the photographs to be wide-angle views or maybe even just close-ups, but the variety of season and light and subject matter will strengthen your portfolio. The last group I want to talk about is my Impressions of Light series. This is an intentional camera motion series. I saw some students using this technique when I was teaching an online course, and it got me excited. This was back about 2007, 2008. And I developed a whole series. I didn't see I saw a lot of impressionistic photographs using this technique, but I hadn't seen a strong body of work using that technique where a large amount of images in a certain style were put in one place. This is Horsetail Falls in February with the sunset hitting it, but I used a little camera motion to make a unique interpretation of that fall. And the camera motion varies depending on the subject. This is a horizontal motion where I'm moving the camera to left and right. In this case, I was panning as the sandpiper, I think it was flying through. This is Mono Lake at sunrise. So actually the bottom half is a stream flowing into the lake. So this portfolio, again, has variety. We have Death Valley here. We have winter trees. Several different types of photographs. Some are closer. I have a poppy photograph, an orchid photograph, one of my high key photographs here. There's that poppy taken in my backyard. And some fall colors in Yosemite. That is the end of this part of the presentation. I have private work. I do private workshops in Yosemite, and I teach the process I'm talking about, portfolio development, in an online mentoring program. You can find that information on my website, and hopefully you'll follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I'm on Flickr as well. And then the star of the show is this a book that I put together. I first wrote the proposal for this book about 12, 13 years ago. And I didn't get any takers from publishers, and I put it aside, and And very, very thankfully, Rocky Nook was interested, and we worked very hard to take what was 138 essays, and we got it down to 60 of the best essays. These are taken from my outdoor photographer column. So hopefully you will find out about the different options for purchasing the book. If you go to my website, you can find out about the collector's edition that I'm offering as well. That is it for now. I'm going to end screen sharing here. Bear with me as I transition here. I'm going to go to something I want to show you real quick, and then we'll get to questions. I've been talking about this process in kind of indirect way, but I wanted to show you in my own Lightroom catalog how I do that. You can see over here my Light on the Landscape collection set. So through the different stages of editing, I made different subsets of collections. But what I've selected here is the full 128 images. And when I want to take a group of images, whatever it is, a one-day shoot or a large body of work like this, I will select all the images, and then I'll use the survey tool. And this is, it gives me an overview of the whole image. There's a lot of images here, so it's hard to see, but let's say, for example, I wanted to take this series of photographs and just do a portfolio of the tree photographs. And I'll be going through that and taking out the ones that don't have anything about trees. And slowly, as I'm paring things down, I start refining the series to just be specifically about trees. And then you start to see, you know, all these tree photographs showing up. And it gives you a great way to assess where you are in a series. Now, if you do this with a one-day shoot, you may have similar photographs, say some subtle differences in light. You can put them up all on the screen and do something along these lines and narrow down to just a set of tree photographs. You know, I'm getting about halfway there. So I just wanted to illustrate that point for you. I strongly recommend using the collections feature if you use Lightroom and organizing your work to better visualize how you're developing your themes or your portfolio. I'm going to take a quick jump to the book itself in the PDF form. I wanted to show you just to give you an idea of the content of the book. There's a fair amount of philosophy in the book, my just thoughts on why I photograph. There's a fair amount of technique, not so much real geeky stuff, but you know, why I use a simple background. Some very useful approaches. I talk about Focused is the chapter that's about how to develop themes. I show some of my experiments, like my high key photographs. As you see here, I'm talking about macro photography. My vacation, I talk about in several of the chapters about how I balance my family life with my photographic life and going on trips with family and still managing to take some photographs. So I wanted to give you a sense of that, and then just to give you a little sense of the layout. It's a very elegantly designed book. There's a lot of writing, there's a lot of density. It's not just photographs, it's quite dense with essays. And some of it can be sort of basic, but most of it is more for advanced photographers, and I feel this book would be useful for photographers at any level. So all these photographs that I write about and I'm showing here are written about in the text. And there's the kind of the title chapter, talking about becoming a student of light. Well, I think I've covered just about everything here. So I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you for bearing with me. I hope you've enjoyed this.
Hi there.
Hi.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
We do have we have a few questions here, so let's just delve right into them.
All right.
And some of these are referencing images. You don't have to pull them back up again, but hopefully you'll remember what they were.
All right.
The first question is, in the image of the tree roots over the stone,
Yeah.
how did you get so deep depth of field?
Well, I used a fairly wide angle lens, which inherently has more depth of field, and I used a smaller aperture. It wasn't that tricky, but I think it was just using a small aperture. With 4x5, I would often use f32, f45, which might be the equivalent in 35 of f16, f22. So it's just a matter of using the right aperture.
Great. Another question here is, are we seeing results from film or digital, large format or small?
Oh, good question. The one thing I didn't show you is that in the back of the book, it tells you what cameras were used. So in what you saw, it's probably about 50-50. I used 35 millimeter in the beginning of my career, and then for about 20 years, I used 4x5. So like I say, about half of them are 4x5. The cover image is 4x5. And then starting in about 2005, I did switch to digital. So there's quite a few small format, if you will, images with various cameras, Canon and Sony, depending on the era. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yes.
Okay, good.
Do you use a specialized printer for your black and white photos?
No, I use Canon printers for both color and black and white. They do a great job. And the newer printers have wonderful capabilities in the black and white range. So there's, as far as I'm aware of, there's no need to be using a different printer for black and white.
For some of your pano photos, the dogwood, Merced, did you make the image and crop it to panoramic format?
Well, in particular, the dogwood panorama was taken with a 4x5. And what I did with my 4x5 is I had a film holder that, I put in a sheet of film for a full frame, and I could put in a sheet of film for a modified film holder that was a pano shape. So I actually, that is the total frame. So it's not cropped. So basically I was using a cropped film holder to do my panos. So to enforce that discipline on myself, and I just had two film holders in my pocket. And I used what was called a ready load, which didn't require a darkroom to load the film. So I could load my film into either holder, and I could shoot the same scene, full frame or pano.
Great. When going out, do you plan in advance what you're going to take pictures of? Today it will be patterns, today it will be landscapes, or do you just take it as it comes?
I'm very, very much a take it as you come kind of guy. So, if I'm going to go to Glacier Point and, I'm going to watch the weather. So, if I'm going to get some good storm clouds over Half Dome, I'm going to pick a weather condition, or say the dogwoods that are at their peak bloom. I'm going to go out and I might well focus on dogwood, but I'm not very rigid at all about that. And I'm often drawn to other directions. And so I'm very much into, I guess you'd have to call it a Zen point of view, where I'm taking what's in front of me. And sometimes what I plan to do, like the Lake Louise photograph, what I wanted was dramatic clouds over the glaciers, and I didn't get it. And so I could have been disappointed and walked away and not taken my favorite photograph. So that's how I deal with that.
That's great. What is your way of sequencing images for a portfolio or for a book? Do you do DTP work yourself?
What's that?
DTP work?
Oh, I don't know what that is.
They didn't explain it. Maybe if they're still here, hopefully they can come back and
That's how low tech I am.
clarify.
Well, in a book process, it depends, who's doing the book. And a lot of times the designer is doing that sequencing in the book. And I usually am in a situation with a publisher where I'm collaborating. So they may have a design suggestion and I may make a suggestion to change it. And usually the designers do great jobs and I follow that. So I don't have a rigid way of going about that. I look at least the book project as a collaborative process. If it's a slideshow, there's lots of things you consider depending on the subject. You might want to be varying scale. You don't want 10 wide angle landscapes in a row. You want to kind of change the point of view for the viewer, looking wide and looking tight and looking down and looking up and different colors, different seasons. So that what I showed in Lightroom would be where I would do that. You can take that whole grid of photographs and start shuffling them around. They'll just move for you. So you just go and see what works and keep playing with it until you can't take it anymore.
So they came back and said DTP is desktop publishing.
Well, I have done some of my ebooks were designed with InDesign, and those were done in-house here. So those were sequenced through InDesign, and then they were usually sent out to Blurb to as a one-off book project. So with when I'm doing it myself, I would be doing it in InDesign and dealing with the sequence. Depending on what the theme is, it's hard to say exactly what'll work until you see it. I'm a visual person, so I have to see it up on the screen.
So we have a few more questions here. I just want to check in with you because we're coming up on 1 o'clock here. Do you have time to answer a few more questions?
Of course.
Okay, great. How did you keep, what's that?
I'll be here until Zoom kicks us off.
Okay, good to know. How did you keep the dogwood branch sharp in the long exposure of the river?
It's a Zen technique. It's called stubbornness. So it's a matter of patience largely. So there are times of day when the dogwood are just bouncing around and you just can't photograph, and you come back and look for a time when the wind's not blowing. So it's persistence and it's patience. So, and I'll take a lot of photographs. They can jiggle just a little bit and ruin the whole thing. So the dogwood photographs can take me 100, 200 frames to get one sharp. And the wind comes up, I might change shutter speed and aperture to try to, if you use a faster shutter speed, then the water's not as blurred. So you're making trade-offs all the way when you vary your shutter speed and aperture to try to get enough shutter speed to stop the motion and still blur the water behind.
I'm just going to throw this out before I get to another question, which is Rob asked how much motion of camera, but I'm not sure that that's a finished question there. So if Rob, if you're still here, go ahead and.
No, I know what you mean.
Oh, okay, great.
I got it. So I think he's talking about the intentional camera motion. So when I make one of those photographs, I design it like I would a still photograph. So if I'm looking for spaces between the trees, like the winter photograph, where I was moving the camera up and down, first you had to have the right spacing. And then I shoot fairly much a shotgun approach to that, where I set a shutter speed and aperture, and I start shooting with the shutter held down, moving the camera up and down. And sometimes it's faster, depending on the subject, sometimes, say if I have a 2-second shutter speed, I'll hold the camera still for a little bit and then move. So like about half that 2 seconds is still, the camera is relatively still, and half of it I'm moving up. So it's usually a fairly contained motion. Not like I'm going way up and down, but I would be going, say if I'm doing a horizon type photograph, I'm going across like this, not much more than that. Hope that answers that question. I've had that before, so I spotted that.
I hope so too. Rob, if we got it wrong, let us know. Okay, from Sean, he asks, do you look at the work of other photographers, and are there any, landscape or otherwise, that you are inspired by?
Oh yeah, gosh. I very much look at other photographers. I was working at Ansel's gallery and saw great photographers all the time, and I was showing the photographs to customers and hanging exhibits. So in terms of the photographers that inspire me most, probably in terms of black and white, would be Edward Weston, Brett Weston, Minor White, Wynn Bullock. These are old school photographers, long gone, but in terms of color photography, I was very much inspired by Ernst Haas and Elliot Porter. There's tons of inspirational landscape photographers out now, so I spend a lot of time, going through and seeing what people are up to, and I think it's important to have what I call, and you read about this in the book, visual literacy. It's just a sense of history. My parents both were history majors, so I guess I got that from them. But knowing what has been done, not to repeat it, but to know, to get inspiration from what people did and try to put your own spin on it, I guess, and maybe go beyond what they did.
Absolutely. Linda says, I especially love the soft focus photos. What is your strategy to get an image where the image presents intentionally and not as accidental blur?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm actually kind of planning for accidents, so that I'm intentionally looking for accidents. I mean, it's not that random, but I can take a dozen frames at a time, and even hundreds of photographs in one good situation, just because it's more of a sketching process to me, and I'm just having fun with it. It's not, it's kind of the opposite of the rigid view camera on a tripod. So it's kind of me cutting loose and sketching. So, but I do place some controls on myself. So like I said, I'm designing the photograph before I start, standing in the right place where there's good spacing between objects. And then, the randomness does kick in where I'm holding the shutter down while I'm moving the camera up and down. So there is randomness in that. And the process ends up with photographs that are intentionally what I wanted to say. It's just not that the very second I clicked the shutter, I knew what I had that particular frame. So it's sort of a pray and spray process, or spray and pray. But anyway, you get back onto the computer, and you spend a lot of time, eliminating photographs, and often there's a lot of junk. So it's a low percentage process.
Great. There's, real quick before I get back to questions, there's a few questions coming in that I can answer. So I'll just address them real quick, which is, yes, you will be emailed a replay of this webinar tomorrow. That email will also include the links to the special limited edition hardcover version of Light on the Landscape and the paperback edition, and coupons for both of those books. So just for anyone who's asking that, I see that keep popping up. So I just want you guys to know you'll be sent a replay, and you'll get information on both the books and the coupon codes tomorrow in your email. And someone else asked about sharing the recording of this session. And so the link to the replay that you'll be sent tomorrow will be on YouTube. So you're free to share that on your social media or with your friends who you think would be interested. Okay, back to the questions for you. How did you decide how many images to put into a portfolio, and how do you know when it's complete?
How many is related to what the context of the portfolio. So if it's a portfolio for a gallery and you are maybe going to be having an exhibit, you know, it might be a fairly low number, 10 or 20 images. If you're planning a nice big coffee table book, it might be 50 or 100. So it largely depends. If you're putting up a portfolio on your website, you know, if you have one theme and you put up 50 or 70 photographs, people might not get to the end. So I think that, you know, having some discipline like an online portfolio might be 20, 30, maybe 40 at the most, where you need to have a lot of variety, and to maintain interest, you have to have to maintain the quality.
I have a couple questions here about portfolios. So I'm going to try to ask them kind of right in a row since they all kind of go together, but I might miss some. Let's see. Jimmy says, I noticed there's a good deal of variety in your crop form factors in your portfolio. When it comes to putting a portfolio together, I've heard mixed messages regarding the importance of keeping your crop ratio fairly consistent. Can you please share your perspective on this?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's lots of perspectives on that, and a lot of people like the discipline of delivering the photograph just as you framed it in the camera. And I generally try to do that. I shot with a 4x5, and I didn't want to crop, and it was a very intentional process. So I wanted to get it right in camera. But sometimes things don't work out, and so I'll change the cropping only to make the photograph work. So I won't just stick to a standard aspect ratio just because, you know, I'm supposed to. So it's all about the art to me. You know, if there's a better delivery of the subject of the message, and it's cropped and it's an odd shape, that's fine. What happens to me in the gallery situation, you have galleries that have invested in frames, and you have standard formats of those frames, and it kind of forces you a little bit to stay within reason with your cropping. I generally just have the pano shape that I used with 4x5, which is about 2 to 1, and then 4x5, 35 millimeter shape, and then a few long panos that were done where frames are stitched together, like the Antarctica image. And there was a second half to that. I don't think I got to that.
Let me see.
I did?
I think you did. Oh, I've lost.
Well, that's my perspective on it,
Yeah.
is that,
and I think that answered another question that came in, which was, do you follow any specific rules on final cropping of your images? So I think you just basically covered that question as well.
I'd say no. I'm not big on rules.
Can you please give a bit of info about the portfolio development course? Who is a good candidate, and how does the course work?
Well, it's a 4-week course. I won't get into it too much now, but it's we are working on Zoom, looking at images. So I give lessons, and then you make a submission based on the assignment I give, and so we have 4 weeks with a Zoom session each week. So if you go to my website, you'll see the details, and feel free to email me about that.
Great. People are really, really interested in that dogwood picture, because here's another question about it. Would you use layers as in the dogwood picture?
Would I use layers?
I think it's a question about post-processing there.
Yeah. I might, but I never have. I'm so low tech, it's not even funny. So these are all just straight shots and not anything blended. I think that's what he's implying.
Yeah. And
So that would be like one frame for the sharp branches and another frame, the long exposure, and then blending them.
yeah.
And no, I've never done that.
Okay.
Not a bad idea. I'm not against it. It's just that I'm too slow at Photoshop to do that.
And so it sounds like you do a lot of your work in camera, which kind of leads well to the next question, which is what cameras do you shoot with?
Well, the long history is I went from 35 millimeter film to 4x5 for about 20 years, and then starting in 2005, I started using Canon cameras until just a few years ago. I'm now using Sony cameras.
Great.
And I love cameras that, you know, they're all very interesting, but it's a tool, and it's, you know, different tools have different capabilities, but it's still just a tool. So one hopes as an artist that you could take a good photograph with most any camera.
So I'm just scrolling through the chat now because I know there were some questions submitted to the chat. So if I didn't get to yours, go ahead and submit it again, but I do see a few here. Do you share your camera's settings in the back of your book for each image or somewhere in the book?
Yes.
Great.
So every photograph has camera detail. If you wanted, I could share the screen and show them, because I think it's really a valuable thing to see.
Yeah, if you'd like to
You
pull
willing
up.
to do that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll make it quick, I promise. So here we are. I'm going to zip way down to the back of the book. And you will see the thumbnails. So we have, you know, which format. So 4x5, this is a Vista particular camera. The 4x5s just have the camera and the lens. The digital captures include the lens used and the settings. So here it gives you shutter speed and aperture and ISO. Of course, with 4x5, it's analog, so nothing was recorded in that regard. So it depends on whether it's digital or film, but all the digital has the full range, and the 4x5 have the camera and the lens used.
That's great.
So yeah, good question. I have to say, before I forget, I'm really proud of this book. It was 23 years in the making, and you know, you go through the process of making a book. It's, you know, it's a dream to pull it all together. I was inspired by a book by Ansel Adams called Examples, and a book by Galen Rowell called Mountain Light, and they were a similar sort of design. A lot of writing about the stories about making the photographs, a bit of technique, a bit of philosophy, and I think there's a lot of content in the book, and it's a big book. Yeah. It's 288 pages, so there's a lot of content.
And so Deborah had asked, and it kind of goes well with your last answer, how much did Ansel Adams influence your work, especially early in your career?
Well, Ansel influenced me tremendously. I think more about just his persona than the images so much. I mean, I loved his work, and I love the variety in his work. I mean, we all think of his grand landscapes, but he did beautiful photographs, you know, portraits, and he did details of nature. But he was bigger than life. So, you know, just being around him was inspiring. My degree's in environmental conservation, so what he did to help that cause was a big influence to me, and a lot of what I got from my connection from Ansel was people I met that were around Ansel, people that were other instructors or people that worked at the gallery. Or Ansel had a very wide view of photography. He didn't see it just as black and white or just as landscape. he felt that photography was a fine art that should be shown in museums, and he was open to lots of styles of photography. Don't get me going about Ansel now.
We'll be here all day. No.
Yep.
Alan asked, when you're creating your images, how conscious are you of conveying the feeling of the scene as opposed to the look of the scene? And is this in your mind more at capture, processing, editing, or throughout, or does it just come naturally / subconsciously to you?
I think it's mostly subconsciously. I just respond to things, and you know, you just have to get back the film or get back the digital files and see what might have worked. You know, you develop habits of working a scene and trying a wide view and a narrow view, and so I go through a routine in exploring a scene. But you know, the first level of getting a great photograph is to be really, really inspired and moved by what you're seeing. And I get excited about so many things that I see that in nature that it's, you know, it's kind of hard to sift through it. So it comes through subconsciously. I'm not a big planner at all, and I react to what I see and what moves me the most. And then afterwards, I have to decide, well, did I really deliver? And a lot of times, you know, it doesn't meet the grade.
So last question to end on. A few people have asked this. Are you in your backyard?
I wish. No, I'm in my very messy office, and you can't see it, sorry.
Great. So I just want to pass on to you. A lot of people in the chat are saying, you know, this is great presentation, thank you. And I have to agree, this was really great. So thank you for taking your time to do this webinar with us and talk to us about your book, which everyone at Rocky Nook is really excited about it. I know you're really excited about it. I think everyone who's ordered it or ordered it is going to be just really, really happy with it.
I can show, I do have a copy, so. It's a hefty book. I can't hold it still enough to get it to show up right, but it's a hefty book. I'm real pleased. I think you won't be disappointed. Let's put it that way.
So I just want to remind everyone once more before we go, I know a few of you tuned in late, so you will be sent a link tomorrow so you can watch the replay. We'll post this up on YouTube, and then we'll email you that link tomorrow, and that email tomorrow will also include links to the limited edition signed hardcover version of Light on the Landscape and the paperback version, plus 2 coupon codes for each of those books respectively. So you'll get all that information tomorrow. So don't worry if you missed it today. You know, you'll get it again tomorrow. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. This was really great and enjoyable. And you know, thank you, Bill, for taking time out of your day to do this with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Well,
will you be able to save the comments so I can see what everybody had to say?
I do. Yes, I can send those to you. Yeah.
Oh dear. Okay.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and thank you so much. We'll go ahead and let everyone get back to their day now. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.